session. So hello and welcome to today's event about John Chase, the first African-American registered architect in Texas, and one of the founders of the National Association for Minority Architects, NOMA, and his house, the Chase residence in Houston, Texas. So I am Sharonda Robinson. I'm a board member with the Austin Foundation for Architecture. And the foundation is excited to host today's event with Professor and author David Heymann. He and I were chatting a little bit before we started today's session, and he's got a lot of good information to share with you all. And he wants you to use the Q&A throughout today's lecture, and he hopes to get to as many questions as he can. So I will just say that I am personally honored to be asked to be with you all today. I was lucky enough to meet John Chase when I was a child in Houston. My family owns a Black community newspaper, and when they first moved into their building, they did a mural on the outside of the building featuring really prominent people in Houston, Black people in Houston who had done good work. And Mr. Chase was one of those folks. And I got to meet him during that unveiling. So this is a really special moment for me, and I'm especially proud to be able to introduce this session. So just a few words about the Austin Foundation for Architecture. You can find us online at austinfa.org or through our partner organization, aiaaustin.org. I've been on the board for about 10 years now with the Architecture Foundation, and I can tell you that at our core, we believe that architecture is key to solving the problems of today and the future, and that cities, which have proven their resilience time and time again, will be reimagined by architects, designers, thought leaders, and inspired individuals from the public at large. So I encourage you to give generously to the Austin Foundation for Architecture and other cultural entities that are working to reimagine the places where we as human beings will thrive in the years to come. So with that, let me introduce our speaker today, our friend, architect and author, Harwell Hamilton Harris Regents Professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, Mr. David Heymann. Heymann's architectural work has been widely published and recognized with design honors, including selection for emerging voices by the Architecture League of New York. He is a contributing writer for Places Journal and the author of the books My Beautiful City, Austin, and what we'll be talking about today, the forthcoming John S. Chase, the Chase Residence. Heymann has received numerous teaching awards, including recognition by Design Intelligence in 2017 and 2018, and he holds degrees from Cooper Union and Harvard's Graduate School of Design. David, if we were in person, you would hear so much applause from the hundreds of people that have joined us today, but welcome. We are excited to hear what you have to say and excited to engage with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharonda. I really appreciate it. Actually, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a very exciting moment for me. We're about to bring out this book. The book has been the work of the last year and a half. Been working with a group of students to draw and to really present and make known this remarkable house, the John Chase residence in Houston. I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to say welcome also to a lot of former students who are out there who are probably at this moment experiencing some anxiety, having suddenly found themselves back in school with me kind of bearing down on them. I apologize in advance for the stress, but I think you'll find this worthwhile. There's a lot of thanks to go around. I want to thank the Austin Foundation immediately because a number of weeks ago when they heard about the project, they leapt out and said, can we please help you spread the word about the book? And we set the first webinar. The first webinar was quickly kind of overwhelmed, and with numbers of registrations, we set up a second one for next week as well. Then the project itself, there are so many people who have been involved in the project. I'll mention some of them as we go along, But one reason to buy the book is at the end of the book, there's a full 2-page spread that tries to name everyone that's been involved, and all kinds of people have been involved, from the Houston Public Library to the Chase family to people at the University of Texas, all over the University of Texas, students, ex-students, friends, photographers, donors, don't forget the donors, I love the donors. And then people who are reaching out now and asking to share that information as well. So thank you all for joining me. The talk should last about an hour. It's time for a little bit less than an hour, but Zoom time is a little bit slower than normal. We'll have time afterwards if you're interested to stay and hang around to do questions. If you would use the Q&A tab to write questions, and then I'll try to scroll through them at the very end of the lecture. I'm going to try to not do a question and answer while we go along, and just see if we cover all the stuff as we go along. So I want to leap in for a moment here. So the subject matter, hold on one second, where are we? There we go. Subject matter of today's talk is this beautiful house. This is the John S. Chase residence when it was first built in 1959 in the Oakmere neighborhood in Houston, so between the University of Houston and the Medical Center, in this stand of really remarkable loblolly pines, which were quite important to Chase on a cul-de-sac, which he and Drusy, his wife, wanted to live on because it was quiet for their children to play. And John particularly loved, apparently, these pines. He was very much, we'll talk a little bit more about that, very much into plants and very much into these remarkable pine trees. Sharonda mentioned that John was the first African-American to be licensed as an architect in Texas. It was one of many firsts, and it's actually one of the reasons this house is interesting, just circumstantially. I mean, he was the first student to actually sign enrollment papers at the University of Texas, the first to graduate from the School of Architecture, the first to enroll in the School of Architecture, the first member of the Texas Society of Architects, the first member of the Houston chapter of the AIA, the first licensed architect in Texas to become a fellow of the College of Fellows of the AIA. Sharonda mentioned that he was the chair and president of NOMA. He was the first African-American to serve as on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, an appointment by President Carter, and first to serve as the president of the Texas Ex-Student Union, which is like a very powerful alumni group of the University of Texas. So just circumstantially, this house is really, really interesting just as a place, the home of a historical figure. But Chase was, according to Drusy, a natural-born progressive. And actually the house bears that out. And it's as interesting, if not more interesting to me, as architecture. I mean, it's really a quite good house. And what I want to do today is talk to you about that architecture, how that architecture serves as a frame of experience to live a life and how it structures the life that's lived there. And then try to draw some conclusions from those observations. So I want to tell you why I'm interested in this particular project, because it actually fell in my lap in a really strange way. So the Houston Public Library, three remarkable people there, Danielle Wilson and Christina Grubitz and Anzilla Gilmore, not with the library, but the architect Anzilla Gilmore, organized a show, a two-part show on John Chase's life. One section was on his life and career, and the other section was on architects who he had influenced who followed from him. And then my dean, Michelle Addington, unbeknownst to me, she saw that show in Houston and was really taken by it, very moved by it. And she asked the library if she could bring it to the School of Architecture. And they said, of course, yes. I was co-chair, still am, of the Lectures and Events Committee. And that thing fell in my lap. And I'll tell you, like, this is not my field of research. I write about buildings and landscape more than anything else. And I knew about John Chase. I mean, I had been a student for a couple of years at Rice. I'd grown up in Houston. And it came up in discussion, are there any Black architects? And who are they? Where are they? And it was mentioned, there's this guy, John Chase. He did this great house, did a lot of buildings, did this great house, a lot of churches. But there were no photographs of those houses, of those buildings. And I left Houston and moved away. And then when I came back to the University of Texas, obviously John Chase was a very powerful alumnus, a very influential, honored alumnus, who had very generously, his family very generously given to the school. In fact, out there in the audience, I think there are a couple of John Chase scholars here with us today. I didn't meet him, but I knew of him. And again, there was this kind of talk of this house that was out there. You couldn't find photographs, or one or two photographs of it, but it was supposed to be this masterpiece that he had done that was worth seeing. So then I was flipping through I was flipping through the catalog of the exhibition though when it first arrived, and I came upon this photograph, and this photograph just stopped me cold. And it stopped me cold because that, most of you know who that is on the right. That's young Mickey Leland. I mean, that's Mickey Leland. Here he is in 1978. He has been one of the 5 first African-American to serve in the Texas government in Austin, but he's just been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, the distinguished representative, one of the distinguished representatives from Houston. And speaking for the community, I grew up in Houston, kind of white liberal community. This is 1978. I'm just graduating from high school here, and this is a hero in my community, very much, Mickey Leland. And here he is. And what got me about this photograph, 2 things. One, he's with this stunningly beautiful young woman who, at the time I saw the photograph, I didn't know who that was. It turns out, of course, a little research, that is Saunders Chase. Now, Saunders Chase Gray, 3rd child of John and Drucy. And they're in the Chase house. And you can see behind them, there's this kind of remarkable party going on. And Mickey Leland looks like happy and at peace here. And that quality coming out of him really struck me. And it struck me also at the same moment, exactly the same moment, that this house, which beforehand I'd been interested in mostly just as a kind of formal thing, it had been that it served as a kind of epicenter for architectural life, for cultural life, for political life, for personal life, all these things in Houston, and that it should be known for that alone. It was just this place in which the architecture supported this remarkable coming together of all these various communities in one place, and clearly from this photograph with apparent happiness. So that's what then got me started. And then I set out with a group of students, Brooke Burnside, Sarah Spielman, and Wei Zhu. I want to thank them in particular. Brooke has stuck with the project since she graduated. She's prepared the drawings for publication. The house went through 2 stages. There aren't many drawings of it. There are very few. On the one hand, many of the drawings were thrown out. On the other, John Chase, when he was doing the house, Drucy told me, he would meet in the morning with the builder and tell the builder what he wanted. And then he would come home at night, inspect it, draw on the floor, make changes. And there's not a lot of drawings of the house. So we set out to draw the house in a number of ways. And also the house changed over time many times. There were many, many small additions, many small alterations made. So rather than trying to draw it as a set of facts or a kind of clinical autopsy, we tried to draw it in light as a place you could live in. So that's what the intent of these drawings are. And the second intent of these drawings were to share the house. First in the exhibition, we added these drawings to the exhibition that came to the School of Architecture. And then already secretly in my mind was the idea that we would make this book that would come out, that would make the house somehow public to a larger audience. So I want to mention one other thing here about voice. So I'm going to speak today about the house. I'm not a historian, and I'm a white man in Austin, and I can speak to a certain degree with authority only about the architecture of the house. And that's what I'm going to do. I want to talk about the architecture and then try to draw conclusions outwards from that. But I want to mention that there are other voices that are also writing about and talking about John Chase. And one of them is my colleague, Dr. Tara Dudley, who is right now writing a biography on John Chase, which will come out hopefully in the next year or so. There's something else to be done. So I want to mention that this is a kind of larger project about making some recognition of John Chase that, from the School of Architecture, which I think is really, really, really important. In any event, I'm going to speak with authority, I think, about this building as an architect, and then try to draw tentative conclusions moving outward from there. So here's this stunning photograph, 1959. So beautiful. There's John Chase with his 2 sons, John Jr., the late John Jr. on the right, and then Anthony, Tony on the left. And just a beautiful, here's a photograph of a man who is house proud. And he has 4 reasons, I think, to be house proud. I mean, the first is he has a house, which is a remarkable accomplishment anyway, for anyone. I mean, anyone proud of having a home. And the second thing I think, which is really also important, and you have to be an architect to know this, as an architect, he has his own house, which is really great. I mean, not many architects build their own houses. It's hard to do, it's expensive to do, and it is a serious undertaking, and it's even more reason to be proud. And the third reason, I think, is that it's a progressive house, which is requires a certain commitment on the part of an architect to make a statement to the larger world. This is how I want to live, and this is how I see the world as it is. And then I think fourth, and I think this is self-evident, I mean, I love the casualness of this photograph, but I think the casualness is completely misleading. I think for a Black man in 1959 in Houston to build a house for themselves is a remarkable accomplishment that needs to be recognized as it is. And I think that that is an extraordinary reason for this man to be standing here as proudly as he is. By the way, you can see Drusi taking the photograph reflected in the window on the right. There's a fifth reason, though, that Chase was and should have been proud, was that his building that house reflected on the fact that his practice was flourishing, which is its own remarkable story. So that house, 1959, Chase officially started his practice in Houston in 1954 when he was licensed. He started it with a Herculean undertaking. It's a great story. He and Drusi joined every prominent African-American church in Houston, and every Sunday they went and visited all of them. And in so doing, they introduced themselves to the kind of growing middle and professional class of Houston, which was beginning to flourish. And Chase began with a number of different kinds of works, but certainly he became well known for building a series of churches. This beautiful, beautiful drawing, the Shiloh Baptist Church, date on that 1954, 1955. So right after he's opened his own firm. He had been working before that. This building is the Colored Teachers State Association building in Austin, 1952, a beautiful photograph by Brent Humphreys, who has a number of photographs he gave us for the book and the show. But he had been working sort of unofficially. He knew construction. His background was in making drawings of low-cost housing, mostly for African-American families. That's what he was doing in Austin prior to joining the graduate school at the University of Texas. And that kind of innate understanding of construction meant that already he was being turned to by people to build all kinds of buildings with all kinds of systems of construction. You can see this is part wood frame, part steel frame. There's all kinds of different things going on. This beautiful building, by the way, is now the Community Engagement Center, which is part of the University of Texas's Division of Diversity and Community Engagement, who are sponsors for the book, which I'm really happy to note. It's worth knowing that he knew the business. I mean, Stephen Fox, who has written a terrific essay for this book on Chase's architectural career, whole career, noted that Chase was affable and gregarious and confident, and through those qualities, he came to know this expanding middle class and professional class African Americans throughout Texas, actually, Bay City, Austin, so forth, Houston, and got a lot of commissions. This a very famous one in Houston or in Austin, the Phillips House from 1965. There's a kind of many of us know this because it was on the way to the old airport, but there's a curious. The people who, Penny and James Moore, who designed the book, did the graphic design, they live in this house. So they're under a ridiculous pressure to do a really good job. And I've been beating them, asking them to do change after change after change. And they've been really, really great, but they live in this house and they worship it. And what was really charming when we were first talking to them was they jumped out, they said, we have to do this book. We love this house, we live in this house. And among the commissions that Chase were getting, obviously houses, churches, but also clinics. I mean, this is the beautiful Hadnot Clinic. I think one of the daughters of Dr. William Hadnot is out there listening to this today. This is a photograph by Gerald Moorhead showing this building in the 1960s. Moorhead also shared his photographs with us of Chase's buildings that he took in Houston. I think you still, though, get a sense of the kind of power of this architecture and the kind of direct kind of optimism of it in many ways, and kind of direct desire on the part of Chase to use this kind of progressive vision to support this kind of community as it grew and as it flourished. As an aside, because it's really beyond the scope of this talk, which is really about his own house in 1959, his career obviously continued to flourish. He opened up offices in different cities, including Washington, D.C., and got increasingly large commissions. He got a tremendous number from TSU in Houston. The MLK Student Center, sorry, the MLK Humanities Building, date on that is 1969. And then a lot of those projects, though, because of their scale and so forth, are collaborative. They're very, very interesting. For example, here at Tuskegee, he collaborated with Paul Rudolph on the Kresge administration building, so forth. So his career, it followed this kind of arc of increasingly large and increasingly successful commissions. But by 1959, it's just astonishing to think about 5 years after starting his own firm, he was in a position to build his own house, which is just almost unheard of. It's really, really a remarkable accomplishment. So here's the house again. This is, I think, my favorite photograph ever of all time of a client in front of their house. This is a Drusi, that same day, that photo being photographed by John, and you can see John there and the reflection in the window, standing in front of this remarkable new house. Drusi said that they had never ever thought to buy an old house. They always wanted to build, and they always wanted to build on the cul-de-sac. And she entrusted the design to John entirely, with one or two exceptions. She wanted a thin kitchen. Later on, we'll talk about, she wanted a chandelier. But that was it. She didn't visit the house. She didn't see a drawing. She didn't see a model. The first time she saw the house, John took her out to see it in construction. The walls had been framed up. And she told me this funny story. She said she burst into tears. She started crying. I said, well, you're crying because you were happy? And she goes, no, I was crying because I had no idea how this house was going to work. There were some normal parts to the house. I'll show you the plan here. There were some normal parts to the house. Like if you look over there on the left side, this is the plan of the first house. There's a row of bedrooms. But then if you look in the middle of the house, there's a big open courtyard, and that open courtyard is outside. And there wasn't anything like that in Houston at all. And all the public rooms, the living room down at the bottom and the kitchen on the right and the kind of den and family room up on the top right, those are all accessed around the court. And actually the ideal way to get from one to the other is to go through the courtyard. Courtyard's open, it's got a lattice over it. The lattice is a screen. But it's meant to be the kind of primary public room of the house. It's the biggest room of the house. It's the one that everything looks into. And I think Drusi didn't immediately know how she was going to make that house, how she was ever going to get that house to function. So one thing that you need to know about that, and I want to talk about this a little bit, is that actually that idea is a very radical idea. We think of courtyard houses today as being normal. Certainly historically they were normal, but at the time that this was being done, it was one of the first courtyard houses, and certainly the first fully interiorized courtyard house in Houston, and also one of the first interior courtyard houses in the US. We'll talk a little bit about that. I want to show you what it looked like inside. This is our kind of perspective drawing of it, and how the rooms open up onto it, and how Chase very early on imagined that it would have this planter and a kind of koi, goldfish pond in the center. That planter is really amazing. It actually goes down to the ground. It's just a cutout in the slab. It's very carefully drained, and you can see planters on the right, and then the kind of easy access and opening and the kind of light that's shaded and not brilliant and hot, but actually habitable and beautiful as it enters into those rooms. That's a radical idea. Again, it doesn't look so radical now, but it was very, very radical then. There were some normal parts to the house. I mean, there were the kind of proper rooms that surrounded it, and these rooms were all air conditioned. And in many ways, Drusi, I think, imagined that these rooms would be where the kind of social life of the house took place. And I'll mention now, and I'll come back to it again, that John and Drusi were deeply involved in the kind of social and political life, not just of their community, but Houston. They hosted a lot. And so the kind of hosting function of this house was really, really crucial to Drusi, but so she couldn't imagine how were people going to move around, how was this all going to work out. There were these normal parts. There was also some funny, strange, innovative parts. This is my favorite. On the very far left, you can see a bookshelf, and that bookshelf is in front of a bar. And in fact, that bookshelf is rolling. It's on pocket track, and you can roll it out and you can cover that bar. And the reason for that, Drusi told me, is that she and John were Baptists. And when the ministers came over, they were supposed to roll that bookshelf in front of the bar. But she told me that even then they didn't roll it in front of the bar that often. But it's just a charming, charming kind of innovative detail that actually speaks to a kind of level of innovation that is actually all through the house. But even those kind of strangenesses, those normalcies, couldn't hide the strangeness of the idea of a courtyard at that time. So there were other courtyard houses in Houston, and actually in architecture, there are more or less three kinds of courtyard houses. I mean, this is the first. This is an idea that the courtyard is a kind of light box inside the house. And it is a thing that just is used to provide a kind of a luminosity to the interior. And a lot of architects, actually beginning in the early 1950s, a lot of progressive architects had experimented with that. And there was already a house like that in Houston, built in 1950, probably the first and quite notorious modern house in Houston by Philip Johnson, the Manil House. And here you see the Manil House. It's a different kind of courtyard. You see how what it's meant to do. It's meant to be this kind of contemplative thing. You're living your house, your life inside, and the courtyard is used often full of plants. There's a door into it, but you don't really go into it. It's this thing that's meant to be this kind of poetic source of reverie that you look into, but it really is not a place where you live. It's the first kind of courtyard. The second kind of courtyard that there were a number of houses like in Houston is like this. This is not obviously in Houston, but this is to show you the type. It's where the exterior wall of the house is drawn out and pulled around to make a kind of garden. And it was done in architecture for two reasons. This is, by the way, Philip Johnson's thesis house when he was a graduate student at Harvard, the house he built actually in Cambridge, still there. The idea was that because modern houses had a lot of glass, you had to somehow recapture privacy. And so in expensive houses around the country, in Houston, especially in River Oaks, there were a number of houses like this with this kind of wall pulled out, typically the same material as the house, to enclose this area. The area was still this thing that you looked into, but it really wasn't, it was imagined as a kind of a choral area, like adjacent, almost like an adjacent house-sized thing that was separate, a threshold to the interior of the house, but really a kind of means by which you obtain a kind of privacy. In Houston, there were a number of houses like this in River Oaks, and there were also a number of houses like this done in kind of modest, modernist developments on the edges of town. It's not clear whether both Drusi and Sondri had mentioned to me that it wasn't clear that Chase was able to ever visit those houses, but he certainly knew of them from they're being published in local papers and so forth. The modernist houses that were done in the subdivisions, this particular tactic was used to hide the less than stellar views that were there. So the third kind of courtyard house is a house where the courtyard is fully enclosed. And there's not many examples before 1959. This might be the earliest one, and I'm showing it to you. This is the Pope House by William Worcester, really a masterpiece. I'm showing it to you because Chase clearly knew about it. It's an early sketch of a Chase house that shows the courtyard having the same circular opening with the kind of beams that cross it. But in this kind of courtyard house, the courtyard is actually brought fully into the house, and it's actually imagined as a kind of great room, a kind of extension of the life of the house, rather than a threshold condition or a bit of the outside that's been captured and made private. So this is a kind of important house. The tactic is an interesting one. It is a tactic to make a small house feel larger and to extend the social realm of the house. So hidden in this unprepossessing house is this great surprising room that remakes the world of the house in a remarkable way. There were only, at the time that the Chase house was built, one or two houses like this in Houston. This is certainly one of them. This is the Cullinan House, designed in 1953 by Cowell and Newhouse. And you can see here, it's actually an interesting house to look at, to compare to the Chase house. You can see the courtyard there in the middle. You can see the rooms arranged around it. But you can also see in the plan that the way you come into the house and the way you proceed across the courtyard, it's half a room that extends the social life of the house, but it really is a promenade to the front door. and then through the front door to the spaces in the back of the house, because you're really passing by all the private rooms of the house, all the bedrooms and so forth. And those are the things that are getting light from that courtyard. So the courtyard, he really is imagined as a step to, and not only that, you'll see in a moment, it really is, with the exception of these kind of small bits that come in, arguably a courtyard that's imagined on 3 sides rather than fully embedded inside the house. The courtyard as a kind of means to expand or extend and make richer the life of a smaller house at that time in the 1950s was really being experimented with by the developer Joseph Eichler out in California. This is an early Eichler house, probably by Quincy Jones, who with Anshin and Allen and a number of other architects were doing these really innovative houses for Eichler at trying to find ways to make these very inexpensive houses have richness, dimension, layering, and so forth. And Quincy Jones was trying to push in the garage and push and pull and trying to find a way to make this kind of flat, boxy house have greater dimension on the inside. And beginning in the early 1950s, was making houses that were these 3-sided houses around courtyards. The first courtyard house in fully kind of enclosed courtyard house is 1957. This is the plan E11 by Anshin and Allen. And if you look at it, I'm going to show it to you and compare it in a second to the Chase house, which was drawn in 1958. This is 1957. Here is compared with the Chase house. And at first, these two things look a lot alike. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. Which makes sense in some ways. I mean, both Chase and Eichler were trying to find ways to make economical houses have richer dimension. And they also both believed in this kind of progressive spirit of the modern ethos. And so the way these houses are imagined, very functionally reconceiving how the function of a house works, is really interesting. On the other hand, I have to mention to you that there are also some profound architectural differences between these plans, and they're really profound. I mean, if you look at them, they look the same. They both have a bank of bedrooms along one side, just flipped over, and then the courtyard, so public rooms, all more or less in the middle. But if you look again at the plan on the left and you compare it to the Chase house, in the Chase house, the court is surrounded by all the social spaces of the house. And in the Eichler house on the left, you pass the private rooms, you pass the service rooms, you come to the front door of the multi-purpose living room, kitchen room, and that opens equally up onto the backyard. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Eichler, in this photograph on the right from an Eichler house, Eichler actually imagined that the backyard was the primary social space of the house, the place, especially in California, where everyone should get together, and that's where you met and where you played and where the family was enacted. You know, that in this kind of loose way. I mean, these houses are very loose. They reorganize the hierarchy of the social relationship of the family, but they do so because the idea is that outside, in the backyard, the family will get back together again. In the photograph on the left, you correctly see how that courtyard actually works. It's a light well more than anything else as you cross to get to the house, as opposed to the Chase house. It's not the Chase house. This is a house from Pompeii. But it gives you a sense in Chase house, actually, that the court is conceived of as in a different way, in a fundamentally different way. And this, even though it's a very old idea, it was very, very new at the time. The idea that the house itself opens onto this more perfect world inside the house that is actually its own room. It's a view of the sky. It's not a threshold. It's the place that you come to. It's the most important room in the house, not the room that you pass through. It's the house that, in this kind of remarkable way, it's a world that over which you have absolute kind of control to imagine in the ways that you wish, which is really, really, I think, quite extraordinary. So about the courtyard, 1 second, I'm gonna get something to drink here. So Drusty told me that she thought that the primary purpose of the courtyard was as a place for her sons to play, and they rode their bicycles furiously around this fish pond again and again and again. And that was what she thought it would primarily serve for when she first saw it that day and broke out in tears. She didn't think that it would serve for social functions, but she found increasingly that when people came over, they were drawn to the courtyard. They wanted to sit there, and they wanted to meet there, they wanted to talk there. And she began to plan social events around the house to take place in the courtyard. And she told me this really, really beautiful story. It's one of my favorite stories about the house. She said that she had a huge event that was taking place in December, I believe, and she planned for a week, and they baked for a week, and it was all going to be out in the courtyard. And that night, a storm came in, and it actually snowed in Houston. I mean, completely. She was like, "Oh, my party is ruined. The snow is." They frantically moved everything indoors. But what she said was this really beautiful thing. She said that instead, people stood in front of the windows, watching the snow fall into the middle of a house, which is just a beautiful vision of how the house might work. Just a tremendous, tremendous thing. Chase seems to have been ambitious and pragmatic in equal measure, much like his hero, Frank Lloyd Wright. And he shared with Wright this particular desire to have plants everywhere, which, trust me, if you're an architect, you know is actually difficult to do, building these planters in, and it requires all kinds of special flashing and waterproofing. It's only the thing that people who really believe in plants tend to do. But you sense it, and you sense it in this kind of that particular thing. This house actually is not so Wrightian. Wright made very few atria, but you sense the quality of this exuberant sense that the life of plants and the life of air, life of water add to the quality of life in the house, something that Wright also believed in. Drusi said that the courtyard never flooded, even though it rained there. There were, by the way, bug screens up there on top to keep the mosquitoes out. Even in tropical storms. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. I asked Drusi a number of times about this courtyard because it's such an unusual place. And she said that she thought that John's motivations were practical, having to do with light, air, children playing. I proposed another theory to Drusi, which she very politely didn't disagree with. I mean, she said it that way. She said, I don't disagree with that. John and Drusi, they were seeking to raise a successful family, and John was seeking to build a successful architectural practice, which is hard enough to accomplish. But their doing so required a tiresome negotiation with the complex minefield of the public realm, in which arbitrary power was decidedly and emphatically against them in many ways, often aligned against them. And in that regard, I think the idea of a courthouse made a lot of sense. This is from a 1955 article by Ian McCarr that was an architectural record. It was on the advantages of courtyard houses. It's a great quote, and it struck me that it had as much to do with the pragmatic reasons. In the courthouse, the individual has freedom for personal expression, which cannot obtrude on the public. Chase was constantly planting and replanting around that courtyard. In the end, he settled on these kind of large leaf exotics and cycads that grow very lushly and beautifully inside that realm. Our word paradise comes from the Persian word for a walled garden. And whenever the Chase family, especially Tony and Drusi, talk about this courtyard, they talk about it in terms that are paradisical, like this remarkable memory. And what's actually interesting in that regard is that both Tony and Drusi have expressed to me that they preferred this first vision of the house. But in the mid-1960s, it was too tight, and John undertook a quite substantial renovation, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But the original courtyard had a longer life, especially as an architectural memory. Drusi told me that late in his life, John proposed building a new house for the two of them elsewhere in Houston. And when she asked him what that house would look like, he told her that he just wanted to rebuild the first house. He just wanted to rebuild that courthouse somewhere else in Houston, a dream that was unfortunately not fulfilled as he became ill shortly before he passed in 2012. But here then is what happened in 1968. The house, original courthouse on the left, with the courtyard and the lattice. You see how it's laid out. And then the renovation on the right, the this kind of remarkable addition of a second story and the enclosing of that courtyard to make a kind of grand public room that served as a kind of public forum. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to walk you through the changes just so you understand it as we go through the changes themselves. So here are the new plans of the house. The plan on the left, you can see the courtyard's gone. That's the ground floor plan on the left. You can see that the courtyard's gone and all of that space. There are still memories of the courtyard. You can see there's that kind of crazy circular rug, and there are the planters. One's under the stair, one's in the ground between this open room and the den. Those are the same plumbing, by the way, that was used for the fish pond, and the same drainage was used to make those planters work. They've been changed, and the floor's been changed, and so forth. But you can see that that whole zone, not that much has changed. Or the living room's still the living room. The dining room has moved out into that kind of large open space. The den's still the den. The bedrooms are still the bedrooms. There's a stair, and the stair takes you up to a kind of game room upstairs. The kids were, when they, in 1968, I think Sonnery was 6, Anthony was 12, John Jr. was 14. They needed more space. They wanted space to spread out. They wanted games. John Chase also loved to play pool, so he wanted a pool table. He wanted a home office, so they put a home office up there. It's the space on the left, top left of the upstairs plan on the right. They wanted bedrooms for all the kids. They wanted bedrooms for visitors. You'll see that that's the kind of primary change. The courtyard's been enclosed. It's still there. The shape of that open great room is still the size of the courtyard. Hanging down in it is the chandelier. That the one thing Drusi wanted for this new house. And then you can see that not that much has changed in plan. Here, just to give you a sense, this is the view on the left of the courtyard of the first house, and from the exact same place, now the view of the renovated house, the great room on the right. And you can see the change is pretty dramatic. And you can see there's some things that still feel the same, but the change, even though it's not that much of a change in plan, the change in the character of the space is really, really fundamental. I mean, it's a completely different space where the courtyard is introverted. This new great room is more broadly extroverted. There's still great windows to look out. There's still a view of sky, but there are more trees and so forth. And you get this sense of the kind of great sweep and flow of this room. There's some unusual details in that view on the right, including that roof that pitches up on the far side. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to mention it right now. You can see what it does. On the one hand, it incorporates the game room down nicely into the kind of a public part of the house, so the kids aren't separate somehow from the world of the adults, and the world of the kids are all partly together. It also kicks up so that it feels more balanced. Like if it were flat, that room would feel really deep up there. And so you instead feel that there's a kind of even ring of spaces around that great central room, which is very, very important to the sense of that room being at the middle of things. And then it does a couple of other things we'll talk about in just a second. So for me, the emblematic, here, by the way, the photograph, this beautiful, beautiful photograph by Paul Hester, of Hester and Hardaway, that he just, when he heard of the project, he goes, David, can I please photograph the house? And he went over, and he and Tony, I think, went over and took this photograph at night. You can see the change. It's really remarkable. It's addition of that second floor above. It's actually quite large, quite tall. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute, but this gives you a sense of the change. You can see in this photograph, part of the change of the character. There's a detail that Chase changed. It's a very Wrightian detail. You see all those little tabs along the trim, along the roof, and those are all kind of decorative shingle trim. They mark a kind of important difference in the style of the house. If before the house had the kind of elegant minimalism that was inspired by Mies van der Rohe, one of the great sources of courthouses in the history of architecture, here the source for this is clearly the kind of confident populism of Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think this is a shift, fundamental shift in the nature of this house, from a kind of introverted, elegant thing to an extroverted kind of populist thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's a really, really beautiful, emblematic sign of the change of this house. I showed you this photograph before. I'm going to show it to you again. It's a great photograph to be completely emblematic of the house as well as that detail. I mean, this is the change. I mean, John and Drusi's family, they've grown, they have different needs. not only have they grown and not only have their needs, but the Chases are entertaining. They're involved in the politics of the city. They're involved in every community of the city. The house is this epicenter. Things are happening. The house just needs to be bigger. And here you can see the kind of graciousness with which that large room holds people, which, I mean, I love this photograph. People are smiling, people are happy. There's just so much going on. You sense it behind you, all around you. There's stuff going on. And yet at the kind of calm center of this are these kind of two remarkable people. John's work had changed to a certain degree. I mean, he did build a home office, but really his work and Drusi's work had become much more, Drusi had been a school teacher, and now they were involved in all kinds of volunteer work in education and religion and the community and so forth. And all of that work involved, in many ways, bringing people here. John did build a home office, although he didn't really use it. He had drawn before in the den, and he continued to draw in the den. Drusi told him because he wanted to be connected to the life of the house. He hated it when he was drawing in his office and he heard the children doing something, and then he would go out and find out what they were doing. He had no problem working with all the action and noise around him, so he preferred to work in the den. Anyway, this kind of change, they hosted for many, often and regularly. There's a great story that Drusi told me about this house that brings us all together. When Mickey Leland was in the Texas house, he would drive back from Austin, and every Friday night on his way back, he would stop at the Chase house. And every Friday night, Sandra told me that Drusi made crab cakes. So every Friday night, Mickey would arrive for crab cakes. And the nice thing about that was he wasn't the only person there. There were always other people there. And so he could pull up a chair at this great table in this great room under this beautiful chandelier. And he could catch up with not just his own district, but with things going on in Texas and the United States and the world. And that was the kind of emblematic change in the function of the house. So I just want to show you quickly how little has changed. That's the old house and the new house. You can see that there's a lot of second floor space. The house doesn't seem to have changed that much. The stair is new, things have moved out. The line of the court's still sort of there. They've added some columns in to hold the second floor up. But if you look at the two plans, the old plan, ground floor plan on the left and the new ground floor plan on the right, there's not that much change, which is really, really remarkable in plan. All the more so for the fact that there were no drawings of this second change, that Chase was making all of these changes every morning with the builder, drawing on the floor, saying, I want this, I want that. I mean, he had a very clear vision of how he wanted this house to evolve and how he wanted it to change. The transformation, as I mentioned before, is fundamental. I mean, it really is. You look at these photographs and you really feel like you're looking at a completely different house. These are among the very few remaining contemporary photographs of when the house was open. This kind of great stair on the left as you enter that leads into this kind of remarkable public room, this beautiful terrazzo floor with these great planters which have fountains in them. This great stair as it rises up. I love this stair, the unusual stair that for a number of reasons. But one is that you can see what it does very, very, very nicely is that when you enter the house, it acts as a kind of screen to allow you to measure the room, who you'll want to see, who you'll want to talk to. And then later on, I'll talk about this again, it serves as that beautiful platform in the middle as this place from which speakers and guests, prominent guests would speak to everyone beyond. And then you can see in these photographs very, very nicely how that tilted roof up there at the top draws your eye up. There's the door to John's office and then kind of great mezzanine of the game room as well. The thing that's changed is, and I think this is really important, is that it's not really a change. Actually, what's more true of the house now is that the space, which was meant to kind of flow through the courtyard and between room to room, now it really flows. I mean, now it moves from one place to another. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Light floods in from these high monitor windows that are very much a kind of Frank Lloyd Wright detail. They're actually the structural members that hold the windows up. They're not window frames that are popped in there. All those things going up, very much Frank Lloyd Wright detail from the Usonian houses, which were like the Eichler houses. His attempt to try to find a way to take modernism and bring it to many, many people. But light floods in, space flows. The house begins to enact this much more primary idea, I think, of what Chase had in mind initially for that courthouse. Here we go, one or two more things. The extent of the change is most readily seen here in this section. In the old house, the public room adjacent to the courtyard balanced it in strength and scale, but now that central room really takes over. It's really that a remarkable place in the house from which all other things emanate. It's simultaneously pleasingly casual and at the same time quite grand. The stair has that same dual charm. I mean, it's the thing that has the, on the one hand, the evidence of remarkable architectural skill, and at the same time, it's functional. At the same time, it serves as this kind of great place that guests could speak from. I mean, you see that most clearly here in their room. I love the idea that the guests are speaking from a platform on their way to the game room. The guests included people like Gregory Peck and Vin Jordan, John Connolly and Lloyd Benson and the mayor of Houston, and all of them were asked to speak from that remarkable platform, or John and Drusy would speak there from on public occasions. Here's the biggest change in the house. Everything, all the comfortable spaces stay the same, but now it's actually impossible to be alone anywhere in the house. All the thresholds, the glass walls, the things that separated, even tacitly separated one space from another are gone. And now everything flows into everything else. And it's not actually possible to be alone. The only place to be alone is up in John's office, and even he didn't want to be alone up there. And this idea that the world structured by the architecture so that many people can interact is what the house did. I mean, it's really funny. I went through a lot of photographs of this house, and there's very few photographs of the house, but there are so many photographs of people of all sorts, all types, all races, all creeds, meeting in this house, flowing through the house, talking in the house being used in all sorts of remarkable ways. So it's tempting to understand the transformation that Chase undertook with the house as the making of a great social stage on which to most efficiently and generously enact the multivarious aspects of his and Drusy's life. From entertaining politicians and clients to hosting community functions, to gathering with friends and family, playing pool with his kids, and still mixing the drink behind the bar when the ministers left, while at the same time making a remarkable home for his family. I think that's the central truth about this space. Here's the home of a happy people, intent on succeeding as normal human beings in and despite an unfair world in which the possibility of happiness and normalcy has been frequently, if not constantly, challenged. It's possible to interpret, I think, the architecture as operational than political, rather than political like in that way. But Frank Lloyd Wright always made clear, Frank Lloyd Wright, Chase's hero, that in architecture there's no distinction between the social construction of a house and the political construction of society. I have one last observation about this house, and it has to do with that crazy tilted roof back there. I described how a decision in this room and in this drawing to lift it makes this room feel balanced. A roof like that is, by the way, called a butterfly roof, and butterfly roofs have been used by architects for a long time. This is an unusual butterfly roof. In most butterfly roofs, the architect makes the roof do this, but here, Chase makes one, now I'm looking at myself on the screen, Chase makes one side flat and one side go up, which is a weird way to make that roof. It means that the decision is intentional. The decision to make that roof pitch up like that is a really powerful decision, because actually all the water, as you can imagine, falling on that roof runs back towards the middle. It would have been easier to just make that roof flat, but he chose to make it tall. And I think the consequence of that is pretty profound. I think the beautiful, beautiful photograph again by Paul Hester. I think the purpose of that decision was to make the house a kind of lantern, where before it had been this kind of enclosed thing hidden away from the street in order to make a kind of safety in which to raise a family. I think here, the house with its overlarge windows, broadcasting light to the neighborhood, is meant to be sort of a lantern to the city and the neighborhood. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the Chase house. I think, I don't know where we are time-wise. Oh yeah, we're right there on time, an hour, unbelievable. When I say an hour, I usually mean an hour and 30 minutes, so I'm really happy that we're right at an hour. I love this house. I'm glad that I've been able to share it with you. It's not well known, and it should be well known. And to that end, I want at this point in time, tell you just briefly about this really beautiful book that we've done with students. I want to recommend that you buy it. I want to recommend that you buy it through Tower Books, which is an imprint of the University of Texas Press. The main reason to buy it from them is that if you buy it from them, all the proceeds come back to the School of Architecture for projects like this, which is really, really important. I want to mention a couple of other things. It's a small first run, and it's really beautifully printed, and we've priced it really low, and it's not going to last long. It's really, really gorgeous. It's the John S. Chase, the Chase Residence. It's not David Heymann and Stephen Fox, John S. Chase, the Chase Residence. I think it's really important. Here are some spreads from it. It's really gorgeous. This is the spread from my section on the Chase House. Here's a spread from Stephen Fox's section on John Chase's career. It's just really, really gorgeous, a real labor of love. And I want to mention a couple of other things about it. One, here's the acknowledgements page, which is really, really crucial. So many people have helped us. Chase family, folks at the Houston Public Library, people at the university, the DDCE, Suzanne Deal Booth Foundation, Cultural Foundation, and Gene and Mickey Klein, who helped finance the printing, the University of Texas, which has stepped in to help print, the President's Office at the University of Texas, all of whom have helped to step in and make this first run possible. So if you're not one of my former students, please buy this book. And if you're one of my former students, you better buy this damn book. Anyway, I think at that moment, I think we're done with the, oh yeah, here's the website. I sent it to you in an email. Look how beautiful that website is. It's a really good looking website, the Tower Books. Here is the UT Press, the web link, so you can order it directly from Tower Books. Just note, if you order it from Amazon, we don't get the proceeds. Yeah. And then a couple of last things in closing. I want to really thank the foundation for stepping up. You can, if you're in the mood, also donate to the foundation. They do really, really great things, one of which was to make this possible. So with that, I think if you have to leave, thank you for joining me. If you can stay, I'd be grateful. And I'm going to open up, I'm going to pop out of screen sharing here in I'm going to do that. And I'm going to go to the Q&A section.
Hi, this is Ingrid. We do have quite a few questions here, if you'd like to answer some of them.
Sure.
People are asking about the house now. Does someone live in it? What is it used for? Can you speak to that?
So there's a question. I see Brian Bedrosian. Hi, Brian. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. I'm going to answer that question live. Current state of the house is actually, Drucy lives there still. She lives there during the week. On the weekends, she goes to Tony's house and spends time with the grandchildren. It is like any house that's been around for that long, since 1968. I mean, it's got a lot of modifications over the years. It's like one of those houses where you go, needs a bit of work. You know, I think it's a landmark. I mean, I don't know, people have asked me if I know about the status of it as a historical landmark. I know that a lot of our students have actually, at various points in time, submitted landmark status paperwork as part of exercises in historical preservation, but I don't know the status of that. So the house is currently lived in, currently still madly loved by the people who live in it and the people who visit it, but it could probably use a bit of work. I'm going to an anonymous attendee here who wrote, if I ask my architect for a courthouse, how do I avoid getting a courthouse? Now, I don't know if that means that I'm going to just answer that live. If I ask my architect for a courthouse, how do I avoid getting a courthouse? Does that mean how do you avoid having your architect make huge mistakes and then end up in court? Because if that's what that means, it means you need to hire a better architect. That's the only way. I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. You may have to send me a revised version of that question. Now, here's a really great question. Another anonymous attendee has asked the question, why did you decide to represent the house with this style of drawing, especially considering the spirit of its evolving populism, as you put it? So this is a really interesting question. And I mentioned, so the drawings themselves are actually quite dramatic, and they're drawn mostly, even the architectural drawings the traditional kind of autopsy drawings of plan and section. They're drawn in perspective with light to give you some sense of what the quality of space in that house is like. We had a lot of discussions about the style of drawings. We did a lot of research into the kinds of drawings that were being made in the early 1960s. And we ended up, particularly as a consequence of the fact that Chase had worked with Paul Rudolph, looking at Paul Rudolph's drawings in black and white, very powerful graphic drawings. We decided, made a very conscious decision to draw the house empty, to draw it quiet. And that's because I think that thinking of it that way, again, I mentioned early on that I can speak about the architecture of it, but I don't have the authority to begin to imagine even the difficulty of John and Drusy and the Chase family's life. So we chose to draw it as a setting or as a stage rather than as an active lived-in thing. So I think in the book, which is full of photographs as well of the house lived in, I think you get the sense of that relationship. I mean, I think that the house itself, what's really interesting about it, or one of the things that's interesting about it, is that the architecture itself is quite abstract, neutral, very, very elegant, and that against all that, the life of the house is exuberant. So if you look at all these photographs and they're full of people, it's Mickey and Sandria and so forth, and you pull that stuff away, then you see the kind of bones over which that life is being layered. So that was the way we kind of chose to make the decision about how to draw it. And then there's a separate thing, especially for architects and architecture students. We tried to find a way to translate that kind of drawing into digital techniques, which Brooke and Sarah and Wei, they spent a lot of time, and we went through a lot of faculty members, Clay Odom and Danelle Briscoe, they all kind of came in and gave us a lot of advice about, this is working, this is not working, this is really, really, but we were trying to find a kind of a new way to kind of draw those houses, and almost a kind of signature way. So I hope that answers that very, very long question. There's a question from my friend Mark Yost. Can you speak a little bit more about who Chase worked for earlier in his career? So Mark, that's a really interesting question. He actually didn't work for anyone. He worked in Austin just for a company that built houses, and he was the draftsman for this company. Drew all the houses, drew the framing, drew all that stuff. And then when he graduated in 1952, and he moved, he had a teaching job offer from TSU in Houston to come teach technical drawing at TSU. And he tried to find a job with an architect, and he interviewed John in Stephen's essay. Stephen actually knows the number, and he quotes directly from architects, but he interviewed with all these white architects, and they wouldn't hire him. And actually, it wasn't that they were all necessarily just shutting the door on him. There were a number of architects who, behind the scenes, would help him with his drawings, or would, in some cases, David Baird, the architect, would literally stamp drawings for John Chase in that period between 1952 and 1954 when he became licensed. And he would meet with architects, but there were a number of architects, and I forget the specific architect that Stephen quotes, but this architect said, I couldn't, for my clients, have a black man in my office who wasn't properly dressed as a servant rather than as an architect, and it would have been damaging to his firm. So it's this really amazing thing. He started his own career. He was literally his own architect from minute one, which is just really, really mind-bending. I mean, just a remarkable thing. But it also then, I mean, he knew the business, and he knew also how to grow it. He knew what was involved socially. He knew what was involved. Drusy, clearly, this would not have all happened without this kind of tremendous support from Drusy, who was on the same page. But it's really, really interesting. He came from construction, and but also very clearly with a kind of vision of wanting to be an architect, which is one of the reasons, I don't know the full details of this, it's one of the reasons why, so the dean of the School of Architecture then was Hugh McMath, and Hugh McMath was very, very interested in breaking the University of Texas restriction against Black students. And somehow, and I don't know the story how, he identified Chase and helped make certain that Chase applied and so forth. So, I mean, it's a really, really interesting story. I don't know the full details. Mark, thanks. I appreciate you joining me. Mark, Yost, and I go back to undergraduate school. Sharon asked a question about, did you cover any research that relates his works to themes found in African architecture and building techniques? I didn't, and I don't. I don't know, Stephen in his work didn't either. I mean, I would say that actually, I mean, there are a number of architects working today, including David Adjaye, who are deeply interested in the subject. David Adjaye, by the way, his office very generously promoted this webinar as well, which I really, really appreciate. But I have to say, I don't know enough about John personally. And also, it's very clear that the primary kind of discourse that he was interested in was this kind of modernist idea about a kind of progressive, open society in which the architecture had the same particular quality of a kind of positive future. And so there's not a lot of in the architecture itself of looking back. On the other hand, in the house itself, there are artifacts, art objects, paintings from African-American artists, from Africa, from all over the world, honestly. I mean, I think that John's interest, and this is speaking from my observation rather than from absolute knowledge, I think that his interest was kind of broad and just 360-degree open. So I can't answer that question for you exactly. You would probably have to ask, but I can ask for you if you'd like, but you should reintroduce her. I can reintroduce you to Drusi and Sandria, and that would be an interesting discussion. I would love to know more about that. I'm gonna scroll down here a little bit. Deborah Fermat, do you think the dentils, let me answer this live. So do you think the dentils are more of a fascia detailing issue than a Usonian reference? Large fascias in human Houston would have been problematic. So yes and no. So the original fascias on the building, so I showed the two plans, and the first house plan and the second house plan, and most of the roof doesn't change. So that what they did was they took, and the original building had a very large fascia board, and then, I'm sorry for non-architects, just for a moment here. There's a very large fascia board, and then also a fairly large, very elegant, very beautifully detailed shingle trim piece that goes along it. And what he did was he came back and added those decorative pieces all along the shingle trim. They actually make it worse because now there are more edges, more places for water that's being blown off the drip on the roof to cause wood rot and so forth. And also, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that the decorative quality, that was something that he wanted because he carried it inside as well. So you can see in that photograph of Sandria and Mickey Leland inside the great room, you see that same detail working its way around what had once been the original fascia of the courtyard. So I think it's large fascias are problematic. In many ways, he made it more problematic. But in making it more problematic, he also changed it from a thing that your eye kind of swept along to a thing that actually grabs your eye as a decorative motif, as a patternistic thing that at a level of detail that attracts your attention. It's really, when you see it in the house, it's very charming. It's also certainly like Wright, abstract. And that's why I think, I mean, I do think the Usonian reference is there. I mean, Chase, according to the people who worked with him, according to the family, he really, really worshipped Wright and actually looked up to Wright as a kind of mentor. Let me see. Someone's asked for the address of the Chase house. You know, I don't know it off the top of my head. This is Sharon H. has asked for the address of the Chase house. You know, let me do the following, Sharon H. Let me ask the Chases if they would be willing to have that address out there in the public realm in a large way. Would you just please email me and I'll find out that question for you and see if I can get you an answer. Charles DiPiazza, my good friend and colleague from the University of Texas, did Mr. Chase do his own landscape? Yeah, he was fearless about this, and he was constantly changing things. I constantly building things, constantly renovating things. Drusi told me that it would have driven her crazy if it wasn't for the fact that he was really, really enthusiastic about these changes and how they were going to make life better. Like, for example, the fountain under the stairs, they changed it a number of times. They changed the planters, they changed the plantings. He had a vegetable garden out in the back of the yard. The yard was constantly being changed. And it actually made it difficult for us to focus on the house as a set of facts. This goes back to that question about the style of drawing. You know, we were trying to find a way, but you look at 10 photographs of the front yard and there's 10 different sets of plants and 10 different kinds of plantings that take place, all of which he did. He had a real, apparently a real green thumb, and it may have also been one of the reasons why he chose that site in those loblolly pines. Yeah, but to be clear, the plantings are, they're, I think, very much an extension of the architecture. And so in particular, with regard to that courtyard and those kinds of plants, it's kind of really evocative, immense, largely, like the sense that you suddenly come into a place where water and darkness and dappled light, where all those things suddenly have a quality, as opposed to flowers or small flowers or little leaves or boxwood. You know what I'm saying? Like where instead you get the sense, the kind of architectural sense of these plants as foreground presences, as opposed to things that make. It's also true that he used boxwood to make edges, to bring you, for example, to the front door, or azaleas to hide the kind of joint, classic Houston detail, the kind of joint, the ground to the wall. But yeah, he did all that landscaping. I don't know if he did all the work himself, but I think so. I think that's what I was told by the Chase family. Axel Enza is asking if I'll ever do a tour of the house. You know, I don't know. Axel, if I do, you will be the first to know. I promise. I just have to answer your question live. Axel, I just said that if you didn't hear me about the tour of the house, I'll let you know if that ever happens. I don't think so. So Brantley Hightower, one of my former students and now a colleague, is asked if I would talk about the process of creating the drawings that appear in the book. How did you or your students go about crafting their look? This is that same question. I think I've answered it. It keeps coming up. I think the drawings, I don't know if you found the drawings beautiful. I think they're really beautiful. We struggled for a long time trying to find a kind of weight to the drawings and a kind of consequence to the drawings, a kind of concreteness to the drawings, based on the fact that we didn't have a lot of facts. And so I think that we spent a lot of time. We built a, just again, a little boring to non-architects. We did build a three-dimensional digital model of the house and then began cutting it and drawing different kind of points of view, trying to find places of overlap. So trying to find places where if we took a section here on the first house, there on the second house would be the same, with the perspective. That perspective drawing, getting those two drawings to work from the same position, that took about a week to actually work out. And then, oh my God, Brantley, we've gone through so many versions of blacks and grays and whites and so forth. But I think, again, this goes back to this question. I think we were there's no other way. This is a straight up subjective answer. And we were trying to find a way to show that house in this kind of quiet repose against which the life of the house was lived. I'm gonna jump around here. I'm gonna answer Greg Street. Hi, Greg. Good to see your name here. Thanks for joining. Greg asked, what was the biggest challenge in the research and the production of the book, aside from not having working drawings to reference? There are a couple of challenges, and I'll tell you one that's very personal. I actually feel like this is not my story to tell. Do you know what I'm saying? Like this is a very odd thing for me. I mean, I feel this is like a very important house. I feel like it should be known. I feel like I feel that in many ways it's a story that I have only limited rights to tell. And so like, for me, you guys, all my former students know me. I'll just talk for hours about anything. I'll invent all kinds of crap, just to, all kinds of theories and all kinds of ideas about, but I actually feel in this instance that a certain degree of restraint on my part, where intellectually I'm not normally given to restraint, was a kind of challenge. And that trying to find the limits of what it was my right to talk about, and then my right to not talk about, is really, really important. And I think I mentioned this before, that the book, if you look at the cover, you will not find mine. You'll find mine and Stephen's name in the back flap. But if you open the front flap, it's John Chase, and the book is John S. Chase, the Chase Residence. Like, John S. Chase, this is my house. And I think that's really important. So like I think for us, the challenge was trying to figure out how editorially to introduce restraint in a way that was respectful without at the same time somehow reducing to simpleness what the kind of intellectual points were that we were making. So it's a really weird way to answer that question. The problem is actually conceptual more than technical. The technical stuff, you can just do that. You just draw, try some drawings, throw some more drawings to the wall, throw some more drawings, what's working, what's not working, but I think conceptually the issue, and when I heard that Tara was doing this biography, it really lightened me, because it meant that I could step back and just focus on the building and what the building did. Hope that answers your question, Greg. Quick answer to Burton Baldridge about those dentals are driving the architects crazy. Chase, Burton asked if the dentals, they're peculiar and maybe keeping with the spirit of Frank Lloyd Wright, but did Chase ever comment on them? I don't know. I really don't. We couldn't ever find anything about that. I think they're ultra cool, and they're kind of like, I tell you why I think they're ultra cool, because they're the kind of thing that we train architects not to do, to make those kinds of decorative moves. And so I think they were really clearly, I mean, it's kind of weird. People are hoping that they're gonna somehow disappear into some practical answer, but actually they're not practical at all. I think they're meant to make the house visible, to draw your eye towards the house. The same reason that Wright used them in many ways, that Wright was kind of poke a finger in the eye of the kind of elitism, and he was interested in this kind of the broad availability of architecture, and he knew that to a certain degree, that broad availability eschewed elegance in favor of a kind of populism, and that populism often resorted to things like decoration. So someone asked about the original cost of the house or the renovations. I don't know. Thank you for asking. I don't know. There are so many questions. Thank you so much for asking. Sarah Nielsen just sent a compliment. Thank you, Sarah. There's no question there. Just that's very sweet. So Sarah Costa asked the question, I grew up in a very unique H-shaped courtyard house in Houston. I wonder if there's a listing of Chase's work. And on any house, how can we find out who is the architect? You know, I can help you a little bit there. So one person I didn't mention, Stephen Fox, historian, very early on, as he was trying to save us from making terrible historical mistakes, sent me in the direction of the architect Ben Cush in Houston. And Ben, he shared with me Ben's master's thesis, which is a thesis of the development of housing types in modern housing types in Houston in the 1950s and 1960s. And I've never met anyone who knows more about houses in Houston and the architects in Houston than Ben and Stephen. So if you, Sarah, would just email me that photograph or plan, I'll share it with them and try to get you an answer on that. So two people have asked this question. My former classmate Charles Rudolph and is asking a question, and someone else asked it as well. A very quotidian question: how did Mr. Chase choose to drain the roof of the addition? So actually initially the roof just drained, literally, it was just a built-up roof, drained to the edges, off of the kind of overhang, and then again on the lower roof, off of the overhang, and so forth. Over the years, the built-up roof, the substructure has sagged a little bit. Gutters have been added. Some drainage pipes have been added, but initially it was just straight up gravity flow. You know, I think in Houston that the problem of wind-blown rain causes some problems, but all the windows are up on substantial enough little kicks to keep the rain from happening. I think that those just the gutters that have been added and kind of downspouts that have been added are there for two reasons. I mean, one, to keep wind-blown rain dripping off the edge of a roof at that starts at 0. It's not moving very fast, so that it can be blown against those high monitor windows. So there's a gutter along the top edge of that monitor, and I think it's there for that reason. And then on the lower portion, some gutters and downspouts have been added, but I think that has to do just with settling of the roof structure. I don't know 100% for sure. Charles, thanks, man. I appreciate you joining. There's a couple of, I'm just going to answer Ashley Jenkins' question about cost again. I don't know the cost. Actually, I never asked. I will tell you one thing though, that which I think is really interesting. The only drawings that exist of the first house is a building permit set. And it's sort of like the house that was built. But one of the really interesting changes is that the house, when it was built, it only had brick along the front, or it was drawn for the permit set. And between the time the house was approved and the time the house was built, Chase actually changed all of the walls to brick, which actually indicated that suddenly probably, and I asked Drusty about this, but she didn't remember the specific details, that probably right at that time, some large commission had come in and had made it possible for him to change the cost of the exterior material from wood siding to brick. I mentioned this before because as a reason to be proud of making a house, that it's expensive to do. Very few architects get to do it. And it's when people build houses, it's right at the limit of what they can afford. And as a consequence of that, it's the kinds of questions that you ask about, what are you solving? They're really, really, I mean, I used to have this kind of rule. I tell students the rule of 4 Bs. There's different kinds of problems. They all start with B, or the solutions all start with B, and they go up in scale. So there's a problem you can solve with a Band-Aid, and there's a problem you can solve with a brandy, and there's a problem you can solve with a bank loan. But the time you're solving a problem with a building, you're into really interesting issues, like really, really kind of fundamental ones about how you want to live your life and how you want your life to project itself to the world. And so I think that, I'll put it this way. I don't know what the cost was, but I know that the cost was the limit of what they could afford, which I think is really, really important. I hope that answers the question. Bill, I'll try to get back to your question here in a second. Karen Pittman, hi Karen. Paul Hester's photograph was taken last year. Paul, again, when we were putting the book together, when I started putting the book together, we realized we didn't have a photograph of the new house, and I wanted to take it at night, right at sunset, and with the lights on upstairs. And Paul Hester, most of you know, terrific. Paul Hester and Lisa Hardway, terrific architectural photographers in Texas. And Paul he was going to be in Houston, and we arranged with Tony, and they went over. And when those photographs arrived, it actually altered the way I was thinking about the house. I mean, I had been thinking of the house really as this internal thing, and all of a sudden, you suddenly saw it against that suburban neighborhood. You suddenly realized how bright it was. And actually, one of the kind of interesting, charming stories when we first began working on the project, Danielle Wilson, who was one of the curators of the show for the Houston Public Library, her grandparents lived next to the Chases. And she said that when she was a little kid, she was amazed. She'd look out the window and these limousines and cars would pull up and people would get out in furs, and it was a very glamorous thing. But that idea of the house is this kind of lantern that drew people to it. That didn't become clear to me. And I had sort of missed the gist of that story and how crucial and lovely the story was. But that really kind of jumped out with those photographs when they arrived. Man, there's so many. Ian Ellis, I'm gonna just answer your question because next up. I noticed in the drawings there was care taken to show newer and larger trees for the plans representing the renovation. What other subtle changes that occurred around the time of the renovation, family, the neighborhood, etc., that have influenced the design that might not be evident to us, or we buy the book to find out? No, actually, I'll tell you some. You should buy the book anyway, Ian, because if you don't, I'll never talk to you again. The neighborhood changed. That neighborhood, the Oakmere neighborhood, is a very, very famous neighborhood, and there's a terrific film on it, which is by John Schwartz. So many of you know at Rice, the professor Nanya Grenadier. Her brother John Schwartz is a filmmaker, and they grew up in that neighborhood. And the neighborhood has changed. It was originally, I don't know what it was. It was originally a famous Jewish neighborhood, and that Jewish neighborhood began transforming with the construction of Minerland in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And it became a kind of predominantly African-American neighborhood. It's now again undergoing kind of change because it's right next to the medical center. It's this really beautiful location along the beach and so forth. So that neighborhood has changed in many, many ways. We were not able to find photographs of the original houses around the Chase house. Most of them are the same, so they've changed somewhat. The trees have grown, the trees have thinned. There are fewer. We looked at a lot of historical photographs to find out the location of trees, how many pine trees they were, how tall they were. And you're right, we did draw them. Yeah. But if you have the time, I'd recommend John's film. It's called This Is Our House, It Is Not For Sale. And it's just a great film about the transformation of that neighborhood in oral just having people being interviewed. And John and Drusi and Tony Chase are interviewed in there. Actually, it's very, very interesting. John and Drusi are in the living room. It's a different version of the fountain under the stairs. It's got lights. It's kind of glowing. Tony Chase, it's really a very charming section where Tony talks about growing up in that neighborhood and feeling that it was this absolute level of normalcy, that living there and living in the house and so forth. So that's that would be where I would turn for that. It's really, really interesting. I'm going to answer two questions at once. One is from Benito, Mexico, and one is from Philip Ryan. Hey, Phil, how are you? And ask me about the materials on the interior as the house evolved. So one of the things that the material palette is pretty straightforward, modern palette. I mean, when the house evolved, they re-poured a floor a terrazzo floor all the way through the house. And with all the kind of curves up for the little fountains and for the planters. And I think that the material palette in that regard is pretty straightforward modern. I mean, there are redwood, large board redwood siding, steel columns, single pane glass, redwood used as a kind of framing members, redwood used, redwood for those of you who are not architects, now a little bit of a problematic wood to use, but one of the things that it does really, really well is it very generously takes paint and it very generously resists weathering. So it was the kind of material of choice in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, and so forth. So the material palette itself, then there are some other materials that are used. There is a wall all in silk. There's a wall all in mirror and so forth. But this goes back to this. I think the primary material is actually plants. Like, there are, it's very clear. I mean, like you walk in, there's that giant tree, I've asked Drusi and Sonia and Tony about, and most of the time they just shook their heads going, that tree, that tree, like there's a dead tree which has been placed inside the house, and these extraordinary plants that grow. When you're in the house, the sound of water and the presence of those plants against the kind of darker palette of the stone and is pretty profound. The terrazzo floor was taken out. I don't recall the exact reason why it was taken out. Sorry about that, guys. I don't have wish I had a better answer for you on that one. Phil, your question is a little bit longer. While the redesign of the area clearly drew cues from the exterior to create the feeling of being an exterior space, there's still an odd, wonderful seeming patchwork of materials. Wood paneling that is either the inevitable collage of renovations coming together or something more intentional. I actually think it's more intentional. This turns back to this question that was being asked about the shift in the nature of the house. I think also indicated a shift in the nature of, and I can't prove this. It's just, this is one of those things where if you look at the architecture and you go, all right, what conclusions can you draw from it? The first house, very clearly minimalist, very clearly the detailing absolutely toned down, repressed, controlled. It's very clear that Chase, if he chose to do so, could control the detailing to absolute perfection, the absolute degree that he wanted to do. So the idea that in the second house, you're right, there's siding, it runs to stone, and the net effect of that actually is to tone down the seriousness of the architecture as it's experienced, not as it's conceived, but as you experience it as a human being. It's not like you go in and go, oh, look at this architecture. You go in and go, oh, it's really nice to see you. I'm really glad that we're here together. Let's sit down and have oh, this is a cool house. You know, like it takes the experience of the place and it slows it down, it draws it 1 or 2 degrees back in that kind of patchwork way. I'm glad that you picked up on that, Phil. Thanks for pointing that out. Damn, you're smart. You were always smart. You're still smart. More questions. Oh my goodness. We're at 4:33. You know, guys, first of all, if I'm going to stop here because I've dragged this on as long as it should probably go. There are so many questions. There are still 44 more questions here. I think what I'd be grateful for and I'd be happy to do is if you'd email me the receipt of your book and I'll answer the question as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, Austin Foundation for Architecture. I really appreciate this opportunity to have done this today. Guys, that was really, I hope you enjoyed it. Love to all my former students. Love to all of you who enjoy the house. And guys, I'm gonna check out here. Please write me and thanks. Bye, everybody. Ingrid, do you have to tell me if it's okay to just bail out here or what you want me to do?
It's okay. And you know what? We'll save the questions for you, so perhaps you can answer them in your next session.
Oh, that's a really nice idea. I mean, I know a lot of the people who are asking questions here, and I really appreciate Bill and Brian and Miguel, and there's so many people I know here. I really, really appreciate Riley. Hi, Riley. Hi, Tara. Hi, Tara. Thank you for. Hi, Roman, for crying out loud. John Murphy. There's so many. Noah Winkler. You just go on and on down the way here. These are all great former students, but also great architects. So I really appreciate all of you joining. And this time I'm going to wave goodbye.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.